It's time to talk music, audio gear, and anything else that crosses our minds. I'm Mark.
And I'm Peter.
And welcome to the Hurton Audio Podcast. So I wanted to touch upon something that we see a lot more of now than we've seen in the past, because this is something that only comes with like 10th, 20th, 50th anniversaries of albums. But I really do appreciate it when bands do the big deluxe box sets where they include demos. Outtakes I'm less fond of, but they are interesting. But specifically like demos, live concert sort of feeds and all sorts. Because as a fan of a lot of bands, you always think, well, what did the other song sound like that was working on? And bands like Queen and all that, they always say, oh, well, we had 40 songs for The Miracle. And then you go, what did the other song sound like? And I think it's very interesting to think about an alternate reality version of albums, and I think you only really get that when they bring all of these demos and mix them in a way where they don't sound so rough around the edges, they sound unfinished. You can sort of like visualize the actual song and how it would have sounded if they chose that instead of one of the songs that actually made the cut for the album.
It's a very, very common practice in like the major label industry as well. Like Dua Lipa was saying about her new album that she'd wrote like 100 songs, but then she'd only recorded like 50 of them or something, or like, you know, like penciled out 50 of them. And it's like, whoa, all that's for like a 10, 15 song album most of the time. But the idea is that then they can pick the strongest 10 songs off, say 100 songs. But, you know, the difference, like, one of the box sets that come to my mind is the Queen's The Miracle collection, like the fully expanded one, because that has like a full alternate take of the album, which has become very common because they have so many different versions and so many different takes of some of the songs that can actually slice together a full version of the album that uses like minimal takes off the original album. So you get like a different performance on every song, but also they do a disc of all the B-sides and songs that like didn't quite make the cut. And that's where you get very, very interesting songs, because these are songs that obviously didn't make the album, but that were far enough into the production side and the recording side to be fully realised. So a lot of the time you just end up getting more songs, and people can get very, very excited about it, especially if it's for bands like, say, Queen and people like Jimi Hendrix and Michael Jackson and Prince, because a lot of Prince's music is unreleased, even though he had fully finished and even shot artwork and press for some of the albums. They are fully realised and then just shelved because he didn't feel like putting them out. So I think you can get, like you say, Mark, very, very interesting, like an alternate world take of a project by an artist that actually it existed, but it never really came out.
Yeah, and one that I've been really into at the moment is U2's All That You Can't Leave Behind album. They've got a big deluxe version of it, and they released it, I think, a year or two ago, or probably... did they release it for the 20th anniversary?
I want to say it's the 20th anniversary, yes.
Yeah, so they'll have released it 4 years ago, but it has a song called Always On, which is like another version of a Beautiful Day, which is really interesting because it parallels it in like the arrangement and like the way the riff is slightly.
Like the chords are like the Beautiful Day chord sequence is the same in this song Always, which is really, really interesting because you're like, yeah, that could have just been Beautiful Day. But they've clearly like refined and iterated on that progression and ended up with like, this is what happened on with Queen's One Vision and A Kind of Magic. There was both originally the same song, and the sort of like there was a fork in the road, and they ended up with two of the same song, like that was going off in different directions. So they're two different songs, but there's a lot of similarities in the lyrical themes, and I'm assuming if you put a breakdown of the chords are quite similar, but a lot of it's based on just like the overall theme of either, say, a chord sequence like Always and Beautiful Day by U2, or like a lyrical theme like the full one anything, which is what ended up being like A Kind of Magic and One Vision, because like A Kind of Magic opens up with the lyrics one dream, one soul, and it's all like one this, one that, as does One Vision, which seems weird on like the same album to have like such a strong theme on two different songs.
And it's really cool because not only with like Always, I actually really like that version of the song.
Yeah.
And it feels like a different song, but obviously, I mean, yeah, I suppose it's no difference having two songs with like a very basic chord progression, but because that's more like it feels more like a riff. You feel like it's more distinctive. Instead of it just being like 1 5 6 4 on regular chords, you just go, oh, this is another full song, but you get used to hearing that progression so much. But Beautiful Days got such a distinctive sort of riff and chordal sort of pattern that goes. That you don't hear very often. You don't even hear like that phrasing as often, really. I think that's what's really cool with it, but always just feels like a nice version, because the thing is with music is even if U2 release a song that's in the style of that album now, it's not truly in that style, if you know what I mean.
Yes.
You only really have, like, every album is a time capsule for the way those songs are written, mixed, mastered, everything. And it's very hard, even if you're a big fan of a band, unless a band, say, like a band like Nickelback comes to mind, for having extremely good consistency within their recordings, where you have 4 albums that are mixed and sonically sound similar. A lot of bands, like U2 is a great example for this, because every project they do often sounds radically different and takes a different direction in how they approach recording. So if you really like an era of a band, it's very difficult to get another song from that era if that era's like moved on. And sometimes this can be like due to band abilities. Like there's some bands where, say, the singer can't hit those high notes, or that tonally the voices have changed, or they've swapped out gear, or even like with a lot of 80s albums, it's that they're not going to do that 80s like ham-fisted production that was popular in the 80s that now you would, even 80s bands don't do that. Like your Final Countdown, they don't do songs that sound like the Final Countdown. They haven't since the 90s. So it's like, if you want more of that, the only way you can get it is by some kind of Rarities release.
It's really interesting as well, because, as you say, some people, and I see this on like Amazon reviews and everything, people complaining that the remastered albums don't sound like as warm. And I think, it's crazy that people are so zoned in on certain sort of textures. Like, that's somebody who's clearly grown up, like, during, say, and this is, again, related to Queen, their remasters. Somebody's clearly grown up listening to, like, the vinyls and the CDs and the original mixes, and when it's got remastered, the main difference with modern production is that there tends to be a bigger emphasis on the low end and the sort of, like, the high end as well. Or the high end is a bit more chiseled out, a bit smoother. This is why everybody loves the Soothe plugin, because they just stick it on and it just ducks all the peaking frequencies. Whereas in the 80s, like, there's some vinyls we have where the hi-hat like rips your ears up because it's so like bright, and
there's some vinyls where if you turn your speakers down, you can just hear the hi-hat sizzle coming off the needle. It's that loud.
Yeah, it's that present. And this was due to like something called the Dolby A effect, where they used I believe it was a noise reduction. It was some sort of noise reduction or utility hardware.
Wasn't it like
effect.
an enhancer, like a high-end enhancer maybe, that Dolby made?
And they used to put it on like the hi-hats and some of the cymbals and I believe vocals as well, to get really, really like bright and like really clear sibilance and sort of treble. Because again, that was a reaction to the fact that a lot of the 70s and 60s vinyls had very minimal top end to a certain degree. So they was trying to really, really, that was like showing how modern the production was, to have this really sizzling hi-hat or really, really pronounced S's on songs. But now it comes across as being very undesirable because everything's smoothed out and like perfected because it's all digital. So people just can do the comparative thing and make it all sound like, pretty uniform, which is actually really good because you can get like a lot better playback when you're cycling through artists. Whereas when you're on physical media, there is no consistency between the, especially like pre-2000, pre-Loudness War and anything like that. There is no consistency between the actual track volumes, really, on a lot of the discs. Even the songs, like across an album, which is expected on certain albums. But, like if all the songs like are the same type of arrangement, you would expect them all to have the same sort of dynamics.
Yeah, and the other thing that I think's cool about these releases, and like I say, for me, the outtakes, they aren't as good because I like to hear fresh things, and the Beatles have a lot of compilations where they have like take 3, 5, 6 of like a song that they've done, and you listen to them, and sometimes they're shockingly similar.
It makes you wonder how they actually managed to pick a take, and what the actual rationale was aside from just gut instinct.
Yeah, and I think it's really cool. Like if you're in a band, or if you are really into music, or if you love the Beatles and you want to go, well, what happened with this take, and what's different, and did somebody mess something up? Because some of them are like half the song, aren't they? And then they stop and reset.
There's clearly like a moment that's happened either in the room or with a performance that has prompted everybody in the band to stop.
But like a lot of people, one of their favourite things about the Outtakes sort of side of these box sets is hearing the bands like talking to each other in the studio, and that's what people really liked with the Beatles Get Back documentaries, that they was just talking to each other and you could hear all this discussion that normally you only hear the finished product. It's a bit like it's a bit like watching a movie, really. You only really see the finished product, and then when you see all the green screens and all the cameramen and everything, you think, well, it's not what you get as the final product is very different to the way it's made. And I think with music, people forget that it's like made over like the course of months or years a lot of the time.
Yeah.
But yeah, I really like the ones that give you like a full set of like demos or or songs that didn't make the cut. Live albums are really nice on these deluxe box sets, just because there's something about a live album, and a lot of people say, oh well, I like the live version because it just has a bit more energy. It just has something to it, it sounds less clinical. And I always think it's really odd that people strive for this super sterile music sort of like studio version, and then a lot of fans really love like bootlegs of concerts, and they love live versions. Like if we think about the 70s and 80s, a lot of bands like say Kiss or Peter Frampton, they got big off a live album that is in theory like the opposite of what you would want, like from a label point of view, because a live album is not perfectly in time, not perfectly in tune for the most part. I mean, obviously some people are very good live, but what it does have is it has a certain amount of energy and excitement that recordings just don't have. Even in the 70s, they didn't have that level of excitement. I suppose they really struggled to capture like drum sounds and stuff in the 70s.
I think the other thing in the very like early side of recording, like say like the 70s, is that the studios were very dead sounding, and they hadn't quite got digital reverb and like accessible reverb tools in most studios. Or if they were in the studios, they hadn't figured out this spatial sort of mixing. So in terms of like having like reverb and echo on everything. So when you listen to like the Peter Frampton album, what really comes across is the room, like the fact that it's on a stage, and it's not like somebody's gone in the studio and put a stage reverb on like on a Lexicon device or something. They haven't gone like, oh, let's go for a dark stage preset. They're on a stage and they pick up that ambience, and that can have a big effect on the actual sound and the sort of fingerprint of an album like that.
Yeah, and I think live albums just have a different like style and a different way of like hearing a lot of songs. And I also think it for the most part, it strips a lot of the production back down to like the most minimal, even if you've got, say, keyboards and stuff like that or backing tracks. It just makes it sound so much funner. But it's like a different version of the track again, and dependent on the version of the concert and stuff, in the time period, it can be a really good time capsule for where the band was at that point in their career. And it's just really cool to listen to when you've not heard it, or say if you missed it, like you missed that tour, and then 10 years later you can go, oh, let me listen to that gig. I think that's really cool.
Yeah.
And we've always said about having like USB sticks of concerts and stuff when you leave, or getting like the file as part of like the ticket and stuff, the feed of the concert, which I know bands like Bon Jovi and Metallica have done in the past.
Pearl Jam did a really, really like insane go at it. Like when you look at their Discogs, there's just got like every concert of the tour is on Discogs, like because people archived it as well. which is just so much effort in terms of just production and like capturing and sending stuff out. But it means like if you're a real like in-depth fan, you can actually just listen to like every show on that tour and try and find the best album in there, you know, the best live album. Because a lot of live albums are like sequence where they go, right, we're going to record every gig on the tour and then we're going to pick the best song from each night.
Yeah.
And it's cool that people can actually, say like with a situation like that, or say Bon Jovi, if you managed to get a lot of the gigs, you know, if you attended them all, you would get the USB stick, or you'd have the option to purchase a USB stick. I'm not sure how some of it worked. But yeah, if you had access to all the individual recordings, you can make your own live album, essentially, cherry picking your favourite performances.
Yeah, because I also feel like when you think about the way artists structure their careers at the moment, you see a lot less of like the Rarities albums. And one that comes to mind for me is Def Leppard have a Rarities album with the skull on, and I can't quite remember what the name is.
It was Retroactive.
Retroactive, there we go. And that has really good songs on. Like some of my favourite Def Leppard songs, like Miss You in a Heartbeat and stuff, they're on that Rarities thing. And I find it really odd sometimes with some of the bands that they can be like, oh, well, here's a song that we had sitting on the shelf and that we never used. And you listen to it and go, like a lot of fans will listen to it and go, why didn't you use that song? That song's clearly better than like 4 songs off the last album. But obviously it's all about taste and it's all about preference and dependent on what people like and what the bands think people like. And that plays a big part with music in general or anything.
Do you think that there's a lot less Rarities albums coming out because people are more prone to just releasing singles? So if a song's finished, they just sort of stick it out there and don't worry about the actual format of the release?
Yeah, I think that probably streaming makes it a lot easier for somebody to go, oh, okay, let's just put this song out. And we don't need to call it like a Rarities thing because we can just put it out and see what people think. Rarities tend to be like an afterthought a lot of the time, like with vaults. If say a label's like, oh, well, we haven't got anything out this band because they've been stuck in the studio for 4 years or 5 years, they can be like, right, just stick this out and we can keep that fan base happy but also make money off them.
That is very true. A lot of it is the record labels going, right, well, you don't have anything, so let's make something because, you know, you haven't released on to the deadline that we wanted to release from you. Or like you say, like a lot of it was trends, like the greatest hits trend is like a label, like money machine to say, right, well, was it to do with people being more prone to buying like the movie compilations? So they said that, well, why don't we just make compilations because they're selling better?
It was when the record industry started slumping and they started getting less sales. It was a way to claw back as many sales as possible. And I think it was also due to the fact that albums were taking longer to make. So instead of them, like when you look at a lot of 60s bands, they're like, oh, we've got an album in 62, 63, 64, 67, 68, 69. Do you know what I mean? Whereas the Rarities, as the greatest hits was like, okay, so either one of two scenarios. Either the band's taking forever, so let's drop something to get people excited for the thing they're working on, or the band's left our label for a different label. We have all their greatest hits.
Let's try and make some money.
Make more money off them because we don't have them to make new music anymore.
Yeah, because they say on the Eagles documentary, don't they, that they did a tour and they happened to book their tour with the greatest hits that they didn't know anything about coming out.
Yeah.
And then when they went on their tour, it sold like way better than anticipated because everybody had just got this greatest hits album and was like, oh my God, the Beach Boys are amazing. And they said, you know, the reception at the tour was just unbelievable. And it was just one of those coincidences that it was like there was both, I suppose you could think that their former label and them were equally profiting from that move, even though you could say like that each of them were doing it out of spite of the other sort of side of it. Like they was on tour, not on that label. They didn't have access to their songs on that label, I believe. And then the label obviously knew that they weren't making money off the Beach Boys' new releases. But it was interesting, like on that documentary, how they sort of tapered off a bit and then they had to like rebuild themselves.
Yeah.
But I think, like you say, that's another thing when they have these legacy artists, they just want to make an extra bit of money and you think, oh, well, the Eagles will be making all the money off that greatest hits. They're cashing in, and you think, well, actually, when you start looking at the paperwork, you're like, oh, they're nothing to do with this album.
I think the other reason why you see a lot less of this sort of Rarities box set stuff is you say a band like Coldplay comes to mind. They're very much in control of their Rarities, and if a song that they have recorded hasn't come out yet, they're likely to rework it for a future album, which Coldplay have been notorious for doing, like with their fans, that like there's songs that people have said, oh, I know I've heard a demo of this song or whatever, and they still haven't come out. Or like, didn't you say with Moon Music that they're teasing lyrics in the booklet for songs that aren't on the album?
Yeah, basically that's what Chris Martin was saying in one of the Instagram reels, is that there's a lot of lyrics in the album that didn't actually like materialize, and some of them he said, he used the word yet, which all the fans will be like, well, what do you mean yet? That there's a very heavy implication that there's going to be lyrics in that book that are actually coming out in future songs, because, you know, Coldplay is a very fun band to speculate about because they've got all these rumours about the way that they're doing their albums, a bit like the Quentin Tarantino movies, where it's like, I'm only making X amount of films and I'm in the middle now, and then it's like, actually, these things count as one film, and people start to go, oh, you can't change your mind. But it's a bit like that with Coldplay. They sort of have rumoured to be like a set trajectory. So it's really interesting when they're saying like they're teasing new songs. I'm like, well, this album hasn't even come out, and you're already, you know, there's an implication that there's a project coming out after Moon Music now.
I think the other reason, like when you look at bands like Coldplay as an example, that you don't see as much of this like Rarities album and box set sort of thing, is that a lot of the bands are fully in control of what they're doing. Like if they're a big band, and you got to remember, only the bands that are really big will get this treatment, because they're prying off the fan base, trying to get as much as possible. So like when they release Rarities and stuff, it's because the band's so big that people are just clambering for anything they can get.
Also, with a lot of the bands, bands like Muse come to mind, where people are just always hounding them for Origin of Symmetry. And so there was like, here's Origin of Symmetry completely remixed and actually extended. Like they'd put more of the sort of things that were cut out into it and mix like hidden elements up and put it out on vinyl, so everybody's complaining at them for doing like more poppy music or going in a different direction can get, you know, a bit of what they want again. And say like Weezer as well, they've just announced their 30th anniversary version of the Blue album with 36 previously unreleased recordings, and it does say you get a 12-sided die for playing D&D, which I think is hilarious.
that doesn't seem very on brand for Weezer, but at the same time it feels excruciatingly on brand,
because a lot of people like complain at Weezer for changing their sound, like because Weezer's a very bizarre case of being like anti, like they're like anti music industry whilst being very popular, like in fans' perspectives, because they're like I think they're a slacker rock band. I'm trying to remember what the term
that
is.
Seems right-ish,
because they're like they're very low effort. But then it's not that they're low effort, it's that they're sort of doing the opposite of the bombastic thing. They're like, oh, we're just like, we could be in the garage next door, but we're also like massive. So it's like really interesting, because I feel like a lot of Weezer's the sort of band where a lot of people's like, Weezer's changed. I feel like you hear.
Yeah.
I mean, even the Midnight, they have a new song called Chariot, which I think is absolutely amazing, because it's sort of like a more of a return to their electronic start, their electronic roots. But they actually put on their Instagram stories like this one. They posted like a demo of one of the other songs that's coming out and said, this is for the haters of Chariot.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So I think they've gotten, because it's got like auto-tune sections and more electronic production, which is crazy, because the Midnight have used like auto-tune a lot. If you think about songs like Lonely City, that is exactly the same feeling as what they're doing on Chariot. But people are like, they must have had a bit less of a, or they must have definitely had maybe a vocal minority of people like saying that they didn't like
Heroes, who was really into like that classic rock sound.
I think some people genuinely forget what these bands start as, and they have like in their head is a different band to the actual earlier releases.
Like a great example of that is Biffy Clyro, where they're really at a great point now, but I listen to the first three albums, I just can't listen to them because they've changed so much. And I was going to say they're actually a really good example for a new band that releases B-side records for like 3 or 4 different albums in a row. So it was Opposites had a B-side album called Similarities.
Yeah.
I feel like only Revolutions have one.
All of them had them.
Yeah, there's a lot.
There's a lot of them. There's so many of them. You'll be hard pressed to list them.
So they're a really good example, but they sort of do them as almost like a sister album project. So you have the main album, then you have the sister album, then you have the main album, then you have the sister album. So it feels less like a Rarities thing because they're sort of saying, here's all the songs we recorded that didn't make it. There you go.
And then with the new 2 albums, because of because they couldn't go on tour with it being like the COVID restrictions and everything, you ended up with like 2 A albums, which was really bizarre.
Yeah.
But there was both like you say, one was like definitely a follow-up, visually the same stuff, sort of like a sister album, but because it's not like the other album, they ended up being like on the same playing field because of circumstances. If anything, the second album I feel like was somehow better received.
Yeah, I would agree with that. It had Hunger in Your Haunt and stuff, so it seemed to have more radio.
Yeah, more radio support
stuff than the No North, No South. That's what I always think of.
But, a celebration of endings.
A celebration of endings.
I had to really think for a second to remember what it was called.
It's not like B-sides and Rarities albums and stuff don't come out at all, but I feel like the way the industry moves, a lot of bands are either like in Muse and Coldplay's thing where they are distributing to a label, but the label has no control.
Yeah, I believe that's how Muse is. Once they did Drones, they licensed their music to Warner Bros., but they are calling their own shots, which is really a really interesting circumstance because they basically went independent, but then signed with their label to do all distribution and marketing, which is just the biggest brain move I can think of, really.
And then because of the way the music industry is at the moment, a lot of bands who aren't big enough to say make that move aren't worth pursuing like a Rarities stuff for, because a lot of the bands are too new and a lot of the bands don't last long enough.
Equally, there is a lot of self-released efforts. Like one of the bands that comes to mind where they have a massive and extensive Rarities album is The Outfield. And they're again, they have a big hit being Your Love, which was, according to Spotify, one of the songs of 1984, whichever year it was, early mid-80s, it was released, which I think is crazy how that song could be so big and the rest of their catalogue can sort of fly under the radar. I think they are a really underrated band, but they have a massive like B-side collection. And a lot of bands do, but they're not as maybe celebrated, or they're less bombastic than say like the Weezer one. And there's also a Green Day one for American Idiot that's just come out that making big headlines, because I think for some people it's like a reality check of that album's 20 years old and like don't tell me that.
But also, you remember like on that note as well, I think a lot of artists are doing it in their own way, as opposed to calling it like a B-sides Rarities. Like technically all of Taylor Swift's re-recordings are kind of B-side Rarities because they're taking all the songs, all the demos that didn't make it and putting them all in. So yeah, I mean, like you say, it depends on the artist. Some artists are very big on preserving their body of work, and obviously Taylor Swift comes to mind, and she's like just jammed as much as possible into every re-recording, probably thinking, if you're going to do it, just go for it.
Even with her albums, like all of her new albums that aren't the re-recording, she's like, as it comes out, she's like, here's 9 more songs, or here's like 15 more songs. I'm like, well, they're the songs that you would have to wait like 20 years for an expanded edition for.
That is a good point, actually, and we've seen a lot of people do that, having like an extended version of the album just released like a day or two after people's pre-orders, which is infuriating for people who do pre-orders. But a lot of them are digital only because they don't have to worry about printing it and spending money on songs that theoretically, according to the label and the artist, aren't as good. They can just dump it on Spotify and then just say, okay, there you go, you can listen to it. Or dump it on like a website, or like I saw Sabrina Carpenter did one of her songs, was on the online shop only version. You got like an MP3, an MP3 of one of the unreleased tracks.
Yeah.
So, yeah, they're just teasing it and throwing it around, but it's a lot harder to keep track because
a lot of the Rarities do seem to be, as you're saying, website exclusives, and also like bundled into, say, on release week, they're saying you can buy the album for like $4.99 on my website and you will get an extra song even if you pre-ordered it. you'll still get more. And that's like a big tactic to try and, like we were saying on, I think one of the other episodes, they're trying to squeeze as much as they can out of fans, like, or you could say collectors' whales. They're trying to be like, you're going to pre-order it on multiple formats and then buy the digital album because you want everything. Like Taylor Swift's voice notes, you want the voice notes. So you're going to pre-order, you're going to buy the digital album several times so you can get all of the voice notes. That's like the ploy that they're trying to do. And all of this is to, obviously manipulate the chart sales. So, it's like, oh, they sold like 100 billion copies. And it's like, yeah, but how many people are purchasing the copies? And that's a really interesting strategy.
Yeah, because if you buy Muse had a triple cassette CD vinyl, didn't they? And that's like five physical sales, which is like,
billion
80,000 streams or whatever per individual person. The way it's calculated, probably more than that actually. I don't know if they've rejigged all the statistics and the way it all works now against physical and stuff, but that's just been some thoughts on like collector's editions. We love a good collector's edition, and like say All You Can't Leave Behind by U2 comes to mind, The Miracle comes to mind by Queen. Def Leppard have a bunch where they have little ones, but there's a lot, and obviously there's massive versions of Hysteria as well. Same with the Beatles and Led Zeppelin. But I really like a good collector's edition, particularly if it's an album you really, really, really like.
And if there's an artist that you really like that has some either expanded box sets or even say like somebody like Taylor Swift, where maybe you never got to the last 9 songs on Midnights or whatever, maybe give them a go, see what you think, see if you can discern the difference between an actual mainline album track and a bonus track.
Right, thanks for listening everybody, and see you next week.